Today we have a very, very special guest. We are shifting a little bit from translation, localization, dubbing, subtitling, and we'll talk about something which is really, really interesting, and it's culturalization. So it's a concept, maybe you are familiar with this concept, maybe not. But Kate, who's saying hi Kate, she'll join us in a minute. She has an impressive background, resume, everything she'll tell us has an impact on translation. Mostly, I think, on video games, but we can adapt this to films also. So I will invite Kate to the conversation. Just 1 second.
Maybe a few seconds. There she is. Hi, Kate.
Hi. Hi, how
How
are
are
you?
you? Very well,
I'm
thank you.
good.
And you?
Doing well. It's also
Okay.
cloudy here in Seattle, but it's supposed to be a nicer day later.
Okay. Well, that's great. Now here, I think it's been raining since yesterday, and I think it will continue like this all over the weekend. We have a long weekend and not a very good forecast. But anyway, um, I want to, I mean, I can introduce you, but it's far more interesting if you tell us. You are a cartographer, a geographer, and how you started working on this fascinating concept of culturalization and everything you do.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And yeah, it's been a very strange journey. So I started doing a couple of different things in college way back when. Geography was not my first choice, but I eventually landed into that major, and it really resonated with me very well. And I had artistic skills, so I was able to use that for cartography, for map making, which I also love because, like many people, I've always loved maps. I love travel. I love culture. I love all those things. And so I had finished my undergraduate degree, and I worked a little while as a cartographer. And then I decided to go to graduate school, which took me to Seattle, which is where I'm based. And I did graduate school at the University of Washington, and I finished my master's degree, and that was about using VR for cartography. And that was way back in 1991. So when VR was really not that great, it didn't work very well. Um, but then when I started my PhD, I was, still, in that space. I was exploring using those kinds of technologies for mapping. And then Microsoft contacted our department because they needed a cartographer to work on Encarta Encyclopedia, which a lot of people don't remember Encarta, especially if they're younger.
I do.
But it was yay! It was like the last major encyclopedia before Wikipedia showed up online. And
Yeah.
so I worked on that. I did all the maps for, I helped do all the maps for Encarta. And then I thought it was going to be just a temporary contract, but they kept renewing the contract over and over again. And then eventually they offered me a full-time position at the company. And the position is something that they said, well, just write the job description and then we'll hire you. And which is what I did. So the job description was geopolitical specialist. And my job was essentially to help them with the mapping products avoid, things that are very sensitive that can get them in a lot of trouble in different markets, like, Islas Malvinas versus Falkland Islands. um, those kinds of issues, which can get maps in trouble in different parts of the world. So that was my initial job at Microsoft. But then once I was in that role, a lot of people in the company started hearing that there was like an actual geographer working at the company. So I started getting questions about all kinds of things like, color usage and gestures and all icon design. And I found that I could answer a lot of those questions pretty easily. And so eventually, and then, because the Xbox didn't exist at that time, this was still back in the early 90s, I started working on some of the early PC games at Microsoft. Like I worked on Flight Sim, and then I started working on Age of Empires and all those kinds of games. And
Wow.
and that's when I started figuring out that this was my true calling, is that doing culturalization work on video games was like the best possible job I could ever have. because I've always been a gamer. I love games. I just never really thought about working in the industry. So I went on to create an internal team at Microsoft called Geopolitical Strategy, because the company was making a lot of mistakes around culturalization. And so obviously I worked very closely with localization teams who are all focused almost, primarily on language. But I was looking at everything else. I was looking at the icon designs. I was looking at the color usage. I was looking at character design, the use of history, the use of holidays, calendar systems, date systems, all of these different things that can also impact whether or not a product is going to be accepted in a local market. And nobody else was really looking at that level of detail beyond just language localization. I mean, obviously some localizers and translators, they do look at those kinds of things, but oftentimes they're not paid to look at those things. They're paid to translate. And so it kind of falls outside their normal responsibility. And so I created this team, which I called the Geopolitical Strategy team at Microsoft. And eventually we created internal processes at the company, which still are around to this day. And so that's basically how I got into this. And it was all in the context of doing the work at Microsoft. But that's how I started doing culturalization, but it's also how I got into the game industry too.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, it sounds fascinating. And the games you mentioned, I know you worked in Age of Empires, Halo, Call of Duty. I mean, these huge AA games. I mean, it's incredible. And what would be this notion? What exactly is culturalization? What do you mean when you say culturalization?
Well, to me, what it means is that essentially we're looking at how not just the language not just the language and adapting the language to a local market. We're looking at everything. Language is a part of culturalization. So I see localization as a subset of culturalization. So obviously language is very, very important for legibility so that people can understand what they're seeing. But also culturalization digs deeper, not only to language, but also to, like I said, symbols, color usage, design, the use of themes, like especially in things like games or creative media where you're using history, religion, even in a fantasy game, they often make up fake religions, but those religions often, they kind of mirror existing religions, and we have to be very careful about that. Or putting things in the game that could be potentially sensitive to different markets. So I'm looking at pretty much anything the user is going to interact with, the character design, the environment, the story itself. Sometimes the story might contain a particular problem, like because a lot of writers, they will use allegory to kind of convey like a real world situation, but then they'll kind of wrap it up in science fiction or fantasy to make it easier to have people understand that concept. But that can be potentially sensitive too. So I basically look at the whole thing, the whole package. And so when in the context of games, but also in the context of a software product, the way I view it, it's a world building exercise, because that's exactly what you're doing with games, is you're building a world. But when you build a piece of software, like when I worked on Microsoft Office, for example, that's also a kind of a world. That is a productivity world. It's where people are going to create documents, to create spreadsheets, to create databases. And so it's an experience. It's a place where people go and they're going to have certain interactions with that world and do certain things that we want them to do and that they want to do. And so we have to understand what basically all of the aspects of building a world, and when you think about that, you think like about our real world, what are all the elements that make up this world? And it's like there's so many things that create that experience. And so every product, in my view, every single product is a world that we want people to interact with. In video games, it's more explicit because it's literally a world that you've created.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you need an eagle eye, because I mean, it's incredible. You have to be creative, sensitive at the same time. You have to understand the cultural environment where the game or the software or anything will be marketed. And that's hard because, I mean, to reconcile all those issues and having like a universal product in a way, it's difficult. I never thought about software. I was thinking about video game worlds and, I mean, culture and everything. But now that you say it, we take so many things for granted. You say, okay, they are there, but there's a huge team behind trying to make this work. So it's incredible. It's fascinating. And what about Geography? Geography, yes, that's the name of your company. What do you do there?
Yes. So basically, when I left Microsoft in 2005 because before I was able to get a basically institutionalize this work inside Microsoft, because at Microsoft they have like a master checklist of everything you must do on every single product before it goes out the door. And one of those and a lot of it's technical things like, run virus check and make sure you don't do this. And, but in one of those line items, I actually got a line item inserted into that checklist about geopolitical and cultural issues. So that meant that every product from that point forward into the future must account for these issues before it's released into the public. And so I kind of felt at that point my job at Microsoft was done because I had made it a thing that you must do across all the products. And so I left in 2005 with the intention of becoming a consultant. So I created Geography, and I was really focused on video games because that's kind of where my heart is. It's what I love working on the most. And so that's pretty much what it is. It's been my company that I run, and it's mostly me, but I do have people who they kind of come in and help me on different projects now and then. But I would say that over the last, it's been 16 years now, I would say usually about 75% of my work is video games, but there's always a set of work that is not games related at all. I still do some software projects. A lot of my consulting outside of games is still like very hardcore geopolitical cartographic consulting. One of my first big clients was Google. So they had heard through a friend of mine who was he was the head lawyer for Microsoft China. And he met somebody at Google right around the time I was leaving Microsoft. And the person at Google was complaining about all the map issues and what a big headache it is about, having to satisfy China and satisfy India and satisfy all these other governments on the maps, because that's right when Google Maps and Google Earth were becoming very, very popular. And so my colleague from China, he said, "Oh, you have to talk to her. You need to talk to her about this. She can help you." So I picked up Google as a client early on, and I ended up working with them for about 6 years as they're one of my clients. And I created their geopolitical team to focus on all these issues for Google Earth and Google Maps. So that was really fun. And so I still do some of that kind of work on the side, but all the work for Geography is video games.
Yeah, I have to tell you this because I love your office. And you have the Indiana Jones hat there. Oh,
yeah.
I'm dying.
Yeah. Well, see, I'm a huge cosplayer. Yes. So actually, that's my Indiana Jones cosplay hat. That's my for Thor, my Thor cosplay. So
amazing. I love it. Yes, I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan also, and my husband is dying. I mean, he's watching the live, and he must be dying now because we're huge fans. So, and then you were, I mean, gaming is very closely related to audiovisual translation because most of many audiovisual translations work on video game localization, which involves much more than translating. I mean, it's not just translating, but it's localizing, which is like a step further. This culturalization thing, it's it's out of proportion because it's much further step. But anyway, you were executive director of the International Games Developers Association. Yes, is that correct?
Yes.
for 5 years. And
Hmm.
what's this association? How can you join? Because I think it would be interesting for some translators working on video games to know this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So when I left Microsoft, I basically, with that goal of working more in the video game industry, obviously I had some connections in the industry already, but I also knew that the IGDA, or IGDA as a lot of people call it, the International Game Developers Association, was a great way to meet other people in the industry, because they have chapters around the world, like Seattle and and elsewhere. So I decided to join the organization in order to interact more with people in the game industry. And of course, you're also kind of marketing the fact that you exist and that your skill exists. And so the first few years, I didn't really do anything. But then as I would go to events like, the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco and E3 in LA and Gamescom and all that, I would meet, mostly I would hang out with translators, because there was no one else, and there still really isn't people who do culturalization for their job. So the closest people to my work was the localization people, so I would hang out with them a lot. And a lot of times I heard them complaining that, hey, no one cares about what we do, we're always an afterthought. And I said, well, let's change that. Let's do something to change that perception. So I created the localization special interest group in the IGDA. And so if you have any interest in the game industry as a translator or as a localization person, I highly encourage you to go check out the localization SIG, SIG, because it still exists and it's still active. And so I'm really happy about that, because I created that group in 2007. And so it's still around. And it's a great way to meet other people in the game industry who do localization. And so that was why I did that. So that I found it really useful. And eventually, because I'm based in Seattle, I was not satisfied with the fact that the chapter here was not very active. So I kind of helped lead that chapter and get it back on its feet. And then by that point, I guess I caught the attention of the board of directors of the global organization, because they approached me about becoming their executive director for the entire organization. And I accepted that role in 2012. And so that's when I ran the organization for 5 years. And so I do encourage you. There are many networks in the game industry. And the IGD is one network that, if you're curious about, the game industry and talking to people in the industry, I definitely encourage people to check it out.
Wow, awesome. Yes, I'm not particularly involved in video game localization, but I know that many audiovisual translators work on that field, and we always complain. Translators always complain about not being seen, not being recognized as we should, but that's for another chat, because it's a very, very controversial topic. And can you give us, I mean, you said you look into different, I mean, when you work on culturalization, you work on symbols, colors, of course, language, maybe gestures, why not? Can you give us some example of the bad culturalization or some errors that may appear in games or whatever?
Yeah, well, there's many examples. I mean, I've worked on so many games throughout the years, because last month, April, that marked my 27th year in video games. So it's been a very long time. But so some examples to talk about gestures. I've worked on dancing games like the Dance Central series, and in the Dance Central series, you've got characters on screen who are dancing and doing their moves. Well, they're making hand gestures. And so I'm looking at the characters for issues that could be a problem in different cultures. For example, in like a lot of Muslim cultures, showing the bottom of your foot is an offensive thing. You don't show the bottom of your foot because it's kind of the lowest part. It's like an unclean part of you. And so like to hold your foot up like that would be a problem. And so of course there's dance moves that might do that. Or another one, for example, is that when in the original version of the first game of Dance Central, a lot of the characters, when the song ends, they freeze. They have like an end pose. And what every character was doing at the end of the pose, they were doing this with their hand out like that. Now, that movement like that for those in Greece, that's the motza. And the Greek motza, that symbol is kind of the similar as this, or this, or this, or that. I mean, all of those symbols are offensive in different parts of the world. So, I even did a lecture at Facebook headquarters a few years ago where I pointed out to them that this is the same as this in some countries. So maybe that's appropriate for Facebook. I don't know, but but so we have to be very careful about things like that. So that's just one of the things I look at. I've looked at character design, where like the character design, they emulate a particular culture. It's not supposed to be that culture, but the artist will borrow elements from a culture to create a character, like for a fantasy world, for example. But then that character looks too much like the existing culture. And so you have to find that distance between them. It's what I call allegorical distance, so that you are trying to have a character that feels, for example, like they're from Nigeria or from sub-Saharan Africa, but they're not supposed to be exactly from that place. And so how do you walk that fine balance between having a character who seems like they're from that place, but they're not borrowing elements that are exactly from that country or culture? And it's tricky. It is tricky work. You have to be very careful about that kind of design. There were many games that have had problems, like the game Fallout 3. They had a two-headed Brahmin bull that was in the game. Fallout 3 is like a post-apocalyptic game. And they had a two-headed Brahmin bull. Yes, it was mutated, and it wandered around, and you could kill it and eat it and all that. It was radioactive. And that two-headed Brahmin bull is the whole reason why the game did not sell in India, because Brahmin bulls, the real ones, are sacred to the Hindu faith. And they actually have laws in India that protect Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And so there was a fear that those laws might actually apply to virtual bulls in a video game. And so that was the whole reason. And so the developer did not want to swap it out for something else because they didn't have time. And they were afraid that if they put a different animal in there, that it could they'd have to rebuild and it could break something. So they just said, no, we're not touch it. And that's unfortunate because, that is the only reason why that game did not sell in India. So, and there's just many examples like this. I mean, I worked on one game during my Microsoft days that had an audio file that had, it was in Arabic, and the audio file was actually a verse from the Quran that was being sung. And they put this audio file into a game that was a very violent, M-rated, like mature-rated game. And the context of that audio file was very inappropriate in the game. And so unfortunately, this got found very late in the process. And so we had to try, I'm not going to go into all the details because it would take too long, but the short story is that we had to pull some of the games from the shelves because they were actually already being sold. And so we fixed the problem. We swapped out the Quran audio for something else that didn't have any lyrics or anything. But then those copies there was about 75,000 copies that already had the audio file in it. And the decision at the time which was a really bad decision, the higher ups said, well, we'll just release it in the US. It won't be a problem in the US. And of course, me as a geographer, I'm like, do you realize how many Muslims live in the United States? Do you realize that, like, Detroit, for example, Detroit's like 50% Muslim, for example. So I'm like, we're not a homogeneous society in the United States. It's a complete mix of people. That's the whole point of the United States. But they did it anyway. And so then 3 months later, the government of Saudi Arabia found out about it, and they got very, very upset. And they got so upset, it became front page news in the Middle East. It was basically talking about Microsoft offending the Islamic faith. And it just started exploding in the region. And so I had to actually go to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, go to Dubai and help do damage control, meet with government officials, tell them what was going on, apologize on behalf of Microsoft. It was a huge mess. It was a really big mess. And it's all because somebody did not check the lyrics of that one audio file. Nobody asked, what is this actually saying and what's the source? And if they had done that, none of that would have happened. So it's crazy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You never come to think about it, but so many factors you have to take into account, especially nowadays, because the world is kind of more sensitive, I think, towards issues.
Much more
Nowadays,
much more now,
much more than in the 90s. And we see what's going on in many parts of the world. There is division, so you have to be so careful. It happened to me. I do subtitles for different companies, and one of them is Netflix. And I was asked to work on a comedy with all the protagonists were African American, and they used the N-word, not derogatively, just as a way of address or to make a joke or something. And we were asked about the meaning of that word in our language, how it was perceived, and how it could be translated without being offensive. And it was like a joint work between all translators and maybe the editor or someone. And then they made a decision of how to address that topic for translation in different languages. They ended up leaving the word in English, which for me, it's like the worst decision ever because it's not understood in all languages. In Spanish, it means nothing, absolutely nothing. But anyway, that's the decision. And so I understand what you say about this question of culturalization. It's not part of our culture. For example, in Latin America, of course, there is racism, but not as much, or I don't want to be offensive, but it's not as marked as in the US, where you have like, nowadays, you have this Black Lives Matter movement, and of course, it's a big deal. Here we have other problems, really serious problems, but maybe not that issue. So this question of one word, two words, how they have an impact on the final product. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, no, it is. It really is, and it's challenging because, and you're right. Every market has you know, that for some markets they resonate with an issue and others don't. Like, for example, there was a game when Resident Evil 5 was developed, and right before it came out, a lot of people, especially in the US, were very upset about the game because it showed this white male with a gun shooting sub-Saharan African villagers who are black, they're basically just running through a village and killing them. And that imagery is so horrible. It's, historically, it brings up all kinds of really negative things. But the game was created in Japan. Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese. So would you expect a Japanese developer to understand that ethnic tension in the imagery that they were showing? And I would say, no, I don't really expect them because they don't have the context for understanding it. However, that does not excuse them. They should have done the research. They could have found out and done the research, but they didn't, because they didn't even know. They didn't even have the understanding that could be potentially sensitive, And like to the terminology issue, like you mentioned, I'm dealing with one of my clients right now is that we're dealing with the issue of localizing non-binary pronouns. Because now a lot of games are including non-binary pronouns, and that's very tricky because some languages don't really have non-binary pronouns, So it's kind of a fascinating and complicated project to see how are we going to do this, and it's a kind of a new frontier.
Yeah, it's a big deal also in Spanish, because people are saying, okay, we have to use this new non-binary way of address. And some others say, no, it's I don't know, it's like desecrating the language or something like that, and it's not the case. I mean,
Right.
there should be something in the middle. I mean, we can come to terms with that, and maybe introduce some new terminology. Why not? The point is that you have to include everyone, of course, especially in video games, because I think there's nothing more inclusive than video games and online gaming and this, I mean, fantastic worlds where, I mean, I'm not a gamer myself, but I'm surrounded by gamers in my family. So I know what you're talking about. And I know how much kids learn from playing video games, although many people think that it's not for learning, but it depends on what you are playing. But you learn a lot, and these issues should be taken into account so everyone feels included. And yeah, it's more and more complicated every day, I think, but it's fascinating.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I love working in games, because it represents, well, it is the fastest growing form of internet on Earth. And it has been for a while. It's definitely the most lucrative. You know, it is a huge money-making industry, you know, as even the last year showed us with the pandemic, because you can't go to a movie theater, but you can download games and play them. So, you know, it's been, and plus to me, one of the other reasons I love video games so much is because, you know, throughout human history, every form of media that we've developed is a way for us to basically to convey story from one generation to another. So whether it was writing, whether it was painting on a wall, whether, you know, whatever it might be, television, radio, all these different forms, you know, film. And to me, video games represent the current evolution of human narrative. It is evolving. How do we move stories from one generation to another? And I just find that, as a social scientist, I find that fascinating. And I love it. I love working in this space.
Yes, it's incredible. And the sense of community. Have you seen? Yes, you have seen what happened with the writer of Berserk, who died, and everybody paid homage to him on the video games, on the online platforms. It was amazing. I mean, maybe people from all over the world with the characters and like paying their respects. And you try to think about it, and I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, that's why I say it's more than internationalization or localization. It's like this sense of community. So what you are saying, for us as translators, maybe we think about this when we translate, of course, but sometimes you are just focused on the words, on the meaning, on the grammar. And maybe if you open your head a little bit more and try to figure out how to convey the meaning, I think it would be a good exercise for us. I mean, in the last years, I had to work with content in Hindi, from Lebanon, from India, or maybe from Norway or Japan. I mean, of course, it was everything. It was translated into English and then into the different target languages, and it's kind of it's harder because you have to do your research and to know, well, will I use formal address or informal address? Will I be offending someone if I use this word or not? So I know what you mean. I mean, it's really hard, and you need an open mind for that. So, well, we address this culturalization, and how is the process? I mean, the workflow for culturalization, for example, in a video game. I think there should be different steps to achieve the final product.
Yeah, there definitely is. So that's one of the things, like when I give a lecture, I often highlight the difference. This is one key difference, I think, in my view, from localization, because typically with localization, you have to wait until at some point where the content is complete, which we know is a joke. It's never really complete, but it's complete enough so that translation can start. and then maybe you'll revise the translation slightly if they change the original. But that has to wait until they get to that point. Whereas with culturalization, for example, I'm working on Dragon Age 4 right now, one of the projects I'm doing, and BioWare they've been a client of mine for pretty much for many, many years. I've worked on everything they've done, all the Mass Effects and Dragon Ages and Star Wars: The Old Republic, and they totally understand the importance of culturalization because we start right at the beginning. So like when a new project starts, I'm looking at the draft script, I'm looking at the concept art, I'm looking at all of the very early ideas, and I'm also, have the ability to talk to the writers, talk to the artists, talk to the producer. So my job at that point, very early on, is to understand what is the world they're building, who is in it, what do they do, what kind of groups are in that world, different ethnic groups, cultural groups, political groups, religious groups, and then what is the player doing in that world? What is the role of the player interacting with the world and all that content that's going to be created? And so very early on, I can do some course corrections and help them understand, like, okay, this idea is not going to work in this region, and here's why. Or that particular character might be a problem in this particular country because of this reason. And of course, when you're doing that kind of course correction very early, it's cheap and it's easy because nothing has been created yet. And so that's why it's very important for my role to be involved early so that I can help them with that, because the worst cases, like when I have to work with clients who they call me in like 2 weeks before the game ships, and they're like, oh my gosh, we just realized that this character design is horrible and we need to change it. And I'm just like, oh, it's like you could have avoided this if you'd done this earlier. Or the very worst case is they actually, I get companies who have come to me who released a game and now they're getting social media backlash, and now they're like, they don't know what to do. And so then I help them with damage control and help them figure out what they should have done. But in the best case scenario, the culturalization starts early, like really early. And then once production actually starts and they head in their direction, the creative direction they want to go, then I will do periodic checks of the content. So they will send me batches of content at different intervals, and I will look at the content. Like another game I'm working on right now is Age of Empires 4. And so, that's been going on for, I don't know, at least two and a half years now. And, they'll send me batches of content showing me all the different units from the different civilizations, and I will do my process of reviewing and making sure that everything is, from my perspective, okay. And even like on a game like Age of Empires, like on all the games, I've worked on the entire series, like we will discuss like the appropriateness of doing certain battles. Like, is that battle controversial in that particular market or that region? Because some battles are controversial. And so we'll kind of walk through that and talk about like which scenarios are appropriate. For example, we would not put in Age of Empires some kind of scenario where we're having, Taiwan and China fight each other. We're not going to do that because, that's too close to, the reality of what the geopolitical reality we live in right now. So that's basically the process. So it's basically early checks, course correction very early, and then during the production cycle, there's periodic checks of content. And then usually by the time we get to the end of production, there's like nothing for me to do, or there should not be anything for me to do because it's all taken care of already.
Wow. Well, it's incredible. I mean, it must be really tiresome. I mean, because it's it's over and over and over. Then when the game is released, you don't want to do anything. I mean, you don't want to even play it, I think, because I don't know.
It depends. It depends on the game. So, some of the games I work on, I don't actually get to play the build. I appreciate when I do, because it's one thing to see all the content like in files and everything. It's another thing, just like with translators, it's really important to see it in context. If you can see the language being spoken in the game itself, coming out of the character's mouth, it's so much more important than just reading it in an Excel spreadsheet. And so I feel the same way. So oftentimes I will get access to a build where I can actually go in and actually see the environment. When I worked on Ninja Gaiden 2 years ago, it's a button masher game because it's a fighting game and you're just constantly mashing the button. I hate games like that. But
Like Mortal Kombat.
because I was well, yeah, exactly. But because I was working with Team Ninja, who was led by Itagaki-san, who I respect his creativity, he's an amazing guy. However, they're very serious. So I said, can I please have a God mode so I can easily just go through the levels, in order to do my job because I'm looking at the environments and everything. And they said no. They said to put in a God mode would disrespect the intent of our game. So this is kind of going back to the cultural values of their team from Japan. So they're like, we're not going to defile our game by putting in a God mode, even when we're in development. So they're like, if you want to do your job, you have to play the game. And so I got to be really good at this game because the only way I could do my job was to actually play this game. And I hate that kind of game, though. I was just like, I can't stand this. Whereas, like fast forward a few years when I worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider a few years ago, that's a beautiful game and it's really fun to play. And so I loved working on that game. I did a lot of culturalization work on that game because they had a lot of, real world cultural elements. Like they had the Byzantine Empire and other things that were in Rise of the Tomb Raider. So I did a lot of work on that game, but it was really fun to play. But by the time the game came out and they gave me my copy, I'm like, I had already played it at least 6 times all the way through. So it's like, no, I'm not going to play this game anymore.
No, it's you get, yeah, it happens sometimes when I'm expecting some movie release or something. I say, oh, it should be great to translate it, and then I say, not so much because I want to enjoy it. I want to be surprised. So it happens to us also. I mean. Because we watch the movie over and over and over again. Maybe we work on preliminary versions and then we have to rewatch it. And then after the 3rd, 4th time you rewatch the film, you say, okay, well, I will not go to the theater. Well, not nowadays. Or buy it on pay-per-view or something because, I mean, I've already seen it. But it's fascinating because, you are being paid to play the game. It's something that you're not playing, of course, it's more serious than that. It's a huge work. But anyway, it's good to be involved from the beginning. I think it's amazing. And what about fantasy worlds? Because, I mean, of course, every fantasy world, it has some inspiration in the real world. But what about that? Do you have to be so careful about these cultural elements also in fantasy, or you have more wider margin in a way?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you have some freedom. You have some more freedom because it is a completely fictional world, and so you can create anything you want to create. However, like you said, most people who create fantasy worlds, the great tremendous majority of fantasy worlds are European fantasy worlds. The culture in those fantasy worlds it's expressly European. Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Skyrim, you name it, all of those
The Witcher,
are all based on The Witcher. They're all based on medieval European culture as the base. So that's why it was fun. Like when I worked on Jade Empire years ago, it was a completely fantasy world, but it was all based on Asian culture. So it had a lot of heavy influence from China, Japan, Korea, India. And so it was really fascinating to work on. That was actually one of the more challenging projects I've ever worked on because we really had to be careful with the elements that were being used and how they were being used because it was supposed to be fantasy and yet you were trying to convey expressly Asian culture. So that was a real challenge to do. But I think with fantasy worlds, the problem is that it is, there tends to be a formula for it, like I said, tends to be European medieval influence. Even if they have a religion in the game, it typically mirrors Catholicism in some way. it almost always, they pick on Catholicism as the model for, Game of Thrones did it, a lot of Dragon Age did it, a lot of other fantasy worlds have done that, where they kind of take Catholicism and then they kind of repackage it as something else, something different, but it feels the same sort of. But I think what's really cool about fantasy worlds is that you have the ability to use allegory to address issues in our world that are very sensitive, but you can do it in a way that makes it more accessible, especially intellectually accessible in the game world. So like, for example, in the Dragon Age series, I love how they took the elves, who in every other fantasy story are like godlike beings. They're like these angelic kind of beings, but in Dragon Age, the elves are actually like the outcasts. They're the kind of the untouchable class in the game. And so there's actually, I think it was in Dragon Age, I want to say Dragon Age 2, I might be mistaken, but they had like a whole sub-theme and like a sub-narrative about immigration issues. And they were using the elves as an example about how they were basically like immigrants to that city or that land, and how people would treat them. And as you talk to non-player characters, some of them would say derogatory things about the elves, like they're thieves or they steal, whatever. And it was kind of fascinating because, because I grew up in Southern California. And so that narrative about immigration and, and having because we have such a huge Hispanic influence in Southern California, that resonated really well with me, that particular narrative in Dragon Age, because I grew up hearing that kind of stuff, even though there's no reason to be that way, but that's the way people are. They are biased, and they're bigots and racists. And so I thought that was fascinating that they decided to take that kind of issue and illustrate that in a fantasy world. Now, it wasn't the main point of the game, obviously, but it was a theme that was in the game, and they had the freedom to do that, because if they had just decided to make a game about real world immigration and all that, what would happen. It would not work.
No.
It would get a lot of backlash.
Absolutely. Wow, that's amazing. I mean, there's so many things to take into account that, as I said before, you take them for granted. I mean, they're there, and you think, okay, but there's some great minds behind that, trying to figure out how to combine everything without being offensive, but at the same time, it has to be appealing, and it has to tell a story, and you have to be engaged, and it should be attractive. Otherwise, you wouldn't play the game or become involved. I mean, well, I love I'm not a fantasy literature fan myself. Of course, Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Of course, I read it. I love it. But or Game of Thrones, I don't know. But just I mean, I'm not so focused on that kind of literature. But what fascinates me is how they create these worlds, how they are so similar to our real world. You think you've been there in a way. I mean, you feel you've been there. And you look at the maps. I mean, when you read Lord of the Rings, you have to look at the map. Otherwise, you won't understand the novel. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, it's like I've told many people that one of the reasons I became a cartographer is because of Tolkien's map of Middle Earth. Because I read Lord of the Rings when I was a long time ago, when I was, I think like 10 years old. But that map, to see the map, and he used cartography to create a world. And I was just so fascinated with the map that he created. And that was one of the huge inspirations for me, why I decided to go into cartography, because I figured maybe I can do something like that too someday. So that it was really cool.
And you're doing it now. It's amazing.
I guess so.
It's not just drawing maps or coordinates or whatever. It's just far more than that. And that's what I find so interesting in your work. I've never heard someone talking about this, and hearing you and listening to you. I mean, it's. I mean, for me, it's mind-blowing, and it makes me think. It leaves me thinking, okay, maybe there's something more behind this. maybe this scene or this cast selection or whatever.
Right.
So I think it's an interesting approach for us translators. So we have like 10 minutes only left because it's been
Okay.
a very, very fun chat. I don't know if people have some questions. I think someone said that it was great that you were a cartographer and currently working on localization. So you're a genius, they say. I don't know if anyone wants to make a question or we can release Kate. No? Okay. Well, I
Well,
think
and I just
we have no question.
well, one thing I would say is, like, kind of to your point you were making, one of the things that I love about my job is that, I am always curious. And I guess it's one of the reasons I became a geographer, because you could absorb so much information about the world. But I love the fact that, generally from one project to another, oftentimes I'm telling them the same stuff that I told the last project. But there's always like some percentage, maybe 20%, 25%, where I spend doing new research on something I never have dealt with before. So like there was a game not too long ago where I had to research Japanese wrestling culture. I didn't even know there was a wrestling culture in Japan, but now I do. Now I've got that knowledge, it's just like, and just recently there was, I had to do some research on indigenous tribal groups in North America, in a certain very specific place in North America, which I was not aware of the culture very well, but now I am. Now I've got that knowledge. And so basically it gives me an opportunity to kind of feed that curiosity, because all these different projects, there's always something that I have to research.
Yeah.
And I love it.
Absolutely.
I really do.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like traveling the world, maybe from your computer or something. When you talk about errors you flagged in video games that were corrected, yes, you told us about this a while ago. So they should be more cautious about what they do, because maybe they are thinking about coding or I mean, that's important, of course. But sometimes the things should be taken into account. So any other error you want to comment? Or I love the story, and geography could be applied into game and localization. I do want to know a family game you can be able to recommend. Oh, family game.
Oh gosh, there's so many good family games. I'm trying to think of one. By family game, I assume you mean ones that people play together. What would be a good one? There's so many good ones. I mean, now I'm trying to remember what the name of the game is. There's that one. Oh God, come on! I don't know. There's a lot out there, and I'm sorry, I'm not being. That includes some of these cultural differences. That I don't know. I mean, I typically work, a lot of the games I work on, I wouldn't classify them as family games. They tend to be, RPGs, first-person shooters, all that kind of stuff, RTS games, real-time strategy games. I actually haven't really worked on many family games other than stuff like Dance Central and some of those kind of games. Most all the games, which tend to be true, most AAA games are not necessarily considered family games. So, but if I think of anything, I'll pass it along.
Great, that's great. Well, we have like 5 minutes left, so I don't want this to be cut off before telling you thank you so much, and on the name of the audiovisual division of the American Translators Association. I mean, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this fascinating topic, which is culturalization. I hope this will help everyone working on the audiovisual field to be more aware of this and maybe learning a little bit more about this. So I've checked out the website of your company, Geography. It's wonderful. So if you want, it's geography.com. I don't want to mispronounce this.
It's okay.
So thank you so much, Kate. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you very much. And if anyone, unfortunately, my website is undergoing a revision because it needs it really bad. So that hopefully I'll have that done in another month or so. But if anyone has any follow-up questions, or if you think of something later, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter as Geography. I'm more than happy to answer questions if you think of something later. So don't hesitate.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you see you next
Bye.
time. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Likewise. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.